college, whatever that may mean, that their house may not offer them, depending on their living situation. And so I'm interested in that concept. I want to hear from both of you. What are the advantages and disadvantages of sort of trying to open under these conditions right now?
All right. Well, thanks for having me. It's a great question. And listen, we should have been thinking about that more when we pivoted back in the spring, right? Because if you think about what the headlines were back then, it was like, hey, Harvard closed and said, go home. Frankly, Penn did the same kind of thing. And I saw a note from the provost that said he basically told the off-campus landlords, tell them to go home too. And, that move by itself said to people, I guess we think that everybody else has some kind of home to go to, which frankly, we already had a lot of empirical evidence that that's not true. Should they open? I think the problem here is that we're conflating two different things. There's opening campus, there's opening housing, and there's opening classrooms. We could open campus, or at least some housing for people who really need it and have nowhere else to go, without opening classrooms. Those are just, college is many things. And what you're hearing from some students is, I don't have a place to sit and even do my online courses if you do not allow me to come to campus. We're not hearing so much from those students saying, I literally cannot learn online. I need to come to campus to be in person. That's not what we're hearing from most of these students. They're saying, I need a place to live. The truth is, if the college wanted to send them money, by the way, so they could pay rent, I think they'd probably be happy in many cases to do it where they are.
What about you, LT? What do you think about this notion of opening or not?
Yeah, I want to build upon that. Number one, the arguments that campuses are making for opening have little to do with equity and access. It's Dabo Sweeney saying we need to play the game, right? That this is about maintaining normalcy. This is about students having the normal college experience that they should have. So if to go back to what Sarah was saying, if the conversation is an equity conversation, then that's really different. So back in the spring, in March, which was still winter quarter for my campus, there was a first generation student who sent me a text message, scared to death that she would have to be quote unquote sent home. And it's not because of violence or anything like that. But she, being the first person in her family to go to college, she's the oldest in her family. She may not have had a home to go to, which Sarah mentioned as well. But then there's certain kind of expectations that are set up when one departs from home and goes to college, a space that for many folks, their parents never see what that means. And to go back home means returning to some situations that people would prefer not to be in. I'll also add mental health components and also those who are not out identifying as LGBTQ plus to their families, and they have different lives when they're on campus and when they are back home. And so for some folks, it's actually unsafe.
And so I want to go back to that idea that you posed, Sarah, which was that several months ago you said we began to pivot. And I really asked, did we begin to pivot? Or, and I'm talking generally in terms of the industry, or did the industry generally sort of find ways to start to defiantly march toward, we have to get back to quote unquote normal as fast as we can? And if so, and if we did that, what opportunities did we miss? What could we have done over the past 6 months had we truly pivoted? And again, I recognize it's easy for me to sit on a podcast and have that 2020 hindsight, but at the same time, 6 months is a long, long time. And many of the indicators in higher education about cost, about ROI, about access, they've all been there for years and years and years. So none of this is new information. It's just been accelerated by COVID. What could we have accomplished had we pivoted a little bit? What specifically should we have done?
I think there's a lot of things, and I was referring to it as the pivot because people called it the pivot, right? But
right.
I agree with you. They didn't pivot all that much, although some faculty literally did, right? They had to move quite quickly and take their class online. This whole thing could have looked different. I mean, I think for 1 second, I do want to just acknowledge that, the role of the federal government, of course, here is massive. And
Sure.
the things the federal government could and should have done are just enormous, including getting us out of this mess in the first place. But look, it was foreseeable that we wouldn't be fixed. It wouldn't be safe to go back in the classrooms in group settings by fall. It would have been straightforward in many ways to develop an alternative approach to housing. It really would. It wouldn't have been if the singular focus was on doing business as usual to bring in revenue in the same exact ways, right? So let's say, like so many schools did, well, we need to make money from housing, right? Because we make money from housing. We could have said, you know what, we're going to have to make money in several other ways. Maybe now is the time to start enrolling more part-time students, right? Maybe now is the time, right, to actually make some equitable moves that allow us to get bigger, not smaller, right?
That's sort of
We
the Scott
could have
Galloway
done that.
model.
Oh, ouch. Sorry.
Well, no,
Let me just
and that one of the things that he has said is that particularly public institutions and land grant institutions, through models of online delivery, can double, can triple the number of students that they enroll and help reduce the cost for everybody potentially.
Sure.
That's been one of his
I'm gonna
contentions.
I'm going to call that the Michael Crow model,
Sure.
just to
Okay.
give credit where
Yep.
it's due.
Yep.
Okay.
Fair.
But
Absolutely.
I would also say it's not just about scale, right? My point is we already knew that we had groups systematically cut out, right? We know that including them can generate more revenue. We know that that if the main revenue driver on our campus is not actually housing, it's retention and completion, right? That the reallocation of resources in that direction could make sense. And by the way, you know, you could have kept a whole bunch of faculty. You could have kept from having to hire and replace and deal with all that down the road by giving them more certainty and by giving them professional development. And the few places that gave faculty stipends over the summer to learn how to be ready online made a very good investment because the students are going to have a good experience this fall, right? There's a lot of things here. I do also, again, in the spirit of giving credit where it's due, this is much closer to what the community colleges actually did.
Mm-hmm.
Many of these presidents saw this coming. They planned on being closed for classes the whole time. They are looking at the universities right now going, well, nice of you to catch up.
Sure. I'm also really interested in what differences have been exacerbated by this pandemic and this and LT, you and I talked the other day, and you talked a little bit about not just the technology gap, but some of the things I had never even considered. When you think about international students and you think about time differences and you think about not just tech differences, but weather differences. Can you talk a little bit about some of the unexpected differences that some of our students experience that maybe we could be thinking more creatively about or tackling in a different way?
Sure, and I'll also bridge this with your prior question too about what else could have been done. A lot of this is like a lost time spent on knowledge access, right, or knowledge acquisition. So right now we are focusing a lot on, again, a pre-existing divide of having to do with technology and a digital divide. But let's say in the state of California, which is primarily a rural state, right, which we don't think about as a state as a whole. But when most of your students are back at home in Fresno and all these types of places, and you're looking at areas that have less than 10% broadband subscription in the home, where students have to drive to Chick-fil-A, McDonald's parking lot in order to gain access to technology. That was stuff we knew already, right? And so now we're starting to see, now people are becoming more interested in it, more invested in it, and it's so late. Like some schools are opening already, and we still have a little bit of time, but certainly not a lot of time. I think the other issue too is for some institutions still wanting to maintain research one, whatever that means to them, but research one um, way of doing business. which is why community colleges are out of running circles around us
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to this issue. And so not recognizing like who students really are in their real lives and things that they're actually doing. So like I said, students from rural areas, um, students who are not in the time zone in which people are actually working. These are like the real problems that people are having. Also, even within the home, issues having to do with privacy. Students, I know some students were actually penalized for not having their cameras on during remote
Mm-hmm.
learning. Right? Students actually being docked for points, students working in bathrooms because that is the most private place in their home. And we think, oh my gosh, I didn't know that those were our students. We thought those were the community college students. No, they're all our students, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are just lingering concerns that have only been laid to bear. Some of us, knew already, but a lot of folks are just playing catch up.
So,
You know
so
what?
you
I
meant,
want to
go ahead.
take you back on that for 1 second because I love that you talked about the R1 phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
right? And part of the thing that happens with R1s is that you got a bunch of people teaching, not all of them, right? But some of the people teaching who, frankly, became great researchers in graduate school, but didn't learn how to teach because that is not what's required. Okay. So, what do you do when you don't know how to teach? You do two things: you lecture, right? And you take attendance and you pretend like that matters. Like that's actually assessment.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Those are the people who right now are like, you're coming to my class, it's synchronous. And if you're not there and your camera's not on, what's the matter with you? You're not going anywhere. It's like there's no such thing as excused absence. And I get that because listen, we're talking about my life. I came out of the University of Pennsylvania, right? I didn't get any teacher training. Two things happened over the last 20 years. One, I actually went out and sought some actual teacher training. And two, I did studies that helped me understand all the things that you just said, LT, that about these students' lives. So look, let's be honest. I'm not lecturing this semester. My entire class is asynchronous, and I don't give a whit about attendance. I care that there is a sign of engagement, basically a sign of life from you every week. Right? It's just a different mindset.
And you went down that research one spot, and that's where I was going to go as well. And a couple things that you said were really, really interesting. We actually had Jonathan Zimmerman on from Penn for one of the pods, and the quote that came out of him that got sort of immortalized on the pod was, "Academic freedom doesn't give you freedom to be a shitty teacher." And that's one of the things that it sort of harkens back to what you're saying, which is, no one's learning how to teach anymore. And he also said there are very few teaching colleges anymore. Everybody's in the hunt to be a research institution.
Yeah, but like let's
Go
flip
ahead.
that a little bit. That
Yeah.
makes that sound like the problem, because this is what we're
Hmm.
doing in higher ed right now,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
academic freedom. No, the problem is with the standards for what you're hiring on.
Mm.
Okay, which is the job qualification from the first place. And the second thing is what you're doing in terms of professional development and incentives. So we bring these people in and then we give them no reason to actually care about teaching.
So,
The
and does
only
does
thing
that
you have
include
to
tenure?
do, of course, tenure
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
very little emphasis on teaching at
Yeah.
R1s, very little. Listen, the best way for me to get good teaching reviews when I was at University of Wisconsin-Madison was for me to put on some makeup. That's what's associated with
Wow.
stronger teaching reviews for women. Okay. The more I was knowledgeable and actually showed it to my students, the more they called me names. That's
Mm.
not how you do that, right? You can break that though as an administrator. You can set up, right, different expectations for tenure committees. You can set up learning outcomes and measure them, right? Like you can do this in an evidence-based way, but it gets pinned on academic freedom as if the problem is that the students benefit from academic freedom.
Sure.
They want to have teachers who are brave enough to talk to them and not hide behind the fact they could get fired at any moment, right?
Well,
And you
and
tell
how
folks you would
systemic are
never,
some of these
yeah.
issues? how, you know, how,
This is the whole thing.
right. So knowing how big and systemic these issues are, one of the questions we often sort of ponder on the pod is this notion of, do you throw the baby out with the bathwater, or is there some path to salvaging higher ed for the greater good in the form that it's in now? I mean, there are so many challenges. You just named a lot of them on the structural side of teaching, and I'm intimately familiar with the ones on the operational side and the debt service side, and all the things that play out on that side. And so when you put those two together, what a mess. And I don't know how fixable is this in the long term, or is this something that you have to go, we've got to throw this out? I'm really curious about what your take on that is.
But before we do, I
Yeah,
wanted
go.
to add to that though, the graduate school students part of this too, who are doing a lot of that teaching, who are
True.
going to be expected to maintain their own course load, do their own work, maintain time and degree, and teach undergraduates. I don't see enough people talking about how they're faring during this time as well.
And I think that's right. And by the way, if they do a lot of that, they're not going to get the R1 jobs.
Right.
Right. Look, I don't think that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. This isn't about whether education after high school is worth it. It's not about whether learning can happen in institutions, right? It's about how we've decided to structure it. We need to make changes. I mean, look at what company in this country has succeeded without a reorg
Right.
every once in a while, right? We need a reorg. We need to work on the business, not in the business for a moment. We haven't worked on the business very well. We haven't worked on how we do onboarding, right? We haven't worked on compensation, working conditions. Let's talk about that in higher ed, right? You want to talk about burnout?
Yeah.
Who isn't burned out right now?
Well, especially right now. And do you think that the reorg, as you called it, do you think that's going to more likely happen on an institution by institution basis, or that there's going to be some systemic swing or change that happens, whether it be government funding, whether it be some mandates with regards to issuing student debt? Is there something that's going to happen systemically, or is it going to be an institution by institution decision to say, look, if we don't make changes, we're going to be out of business?
LT, what do you think?
Man, I want to be hopeful, because my instinct tells me to be hopeful, but I'm just not right now. The other culprit in this is the mainstream media, who always wants to report what Harvard and Stanford are doing and not pay attention to what Paul Quinn and Amarillo College are doing. And for them,
I'm a big Michael Sorrell fan, by the way. Go ahead.
man, I mean, they months ago already said what they were going to do, right?
Of course he did.
And stuck to it and rethinking. So I don't have a definitive answer to this, but I am saying that this is all part and parcel of the same thing. Institution by institution, well, that'll probably be what happens, but that's not going to work.
It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Look, the answer here apparently runs through the mailbox. It's called voting. That's the answer. Okay.
Can't even be the mailbox right now.
There might, if there's a postal service, we've got a hold on that.
I mean, right? So look, I mean, I'm not saying government is the solution to all problems. I am saying government has played a huge role in the structure that we currently exist in. Title IV is a mess, and it has changed everything that we're doing in ways that are not working now. It's the exact target to me of a reorg. I want to throw out Title IV, and I want to start with what does education need to look like, and how do we finance it at the federal level? What does accountability look like, and for whom, right? And what does equity and justice actually look like? And how do we ensure that happens? And are we going to be able to reach every kind of institution with that stuff? No.
Yeah.
But we're going to be able, what government can do is create enough of a change that it starts to ripple. And the individual institution thing, the hard thing is, look, Michael's brilliant. He's on my board. I mean, it's fantastic. How many other schools, though, are looking at Paul Quinn and becoming like Paul Quinn right now?
Right.
They all think they want to, right? And Michael would love to teach them.
Right.
But really, structurally, it's hard to do that.
Who do you think people are trying to emulate though, Sarah?
Oh, I know. It's not him.
No.
I want
Is
to
it
name names.
is it a school in Indiana? No, who is it?
I'm trying to figure out who they're looking at. Like, look, no one's doing great right now. So who's the model? I don't really see. TJ, I've seen you ask about this on Twitter as well. I don't
It's
know
all
who's the
Georgia
most
State,
authentic.
right?
What the hell is Georgia State
Everybody
doing?
wants to be Georgia State today,
Because they
right?
got
Or
analytics.
they want to be Arizona State, or they want to
Sure.
be, and and I think if you ask them at the bottom of everything, they still do think they want to be Harvard.
Yeah.
They do. You can't get away
That's the
from it.
truth. That's the truth.
Yeah.
Well, but another topic we've discussed here with folks like Brandon Bustede and some other folks is this notion of differentiation in the future. And so instead of everybody trying to be like Harvard or Paul Quinn or whoever it is they're going to try to be like, why aren't we moving toward everybody filling a niche in the market that makes sense instead of us all targeting the same 18 to 24-year-old, us all, and second tier institutions charging the same price tag as top tier institutions. Right now we're carrying the full price of tuition on the backs of the student experience almost exclusively, which comes down to student affairs professionals. We're asking RAs and hall directors to be the police and the meal deliverers and the conduct. Like, we're in a really interesting situation. Do we think differentiation is a key component, and especially maybe from an access perspective, or does it take us down a road of more haves and have-nots unless we fix some of the systemic issues first?
Let me just jump in real quick. Sarah, I'll set you up really nice. Part of this is because, like I said before, we're not viewing it as an equity and access issue.
Mm-hmm.
We're viewing this as a temporary inconvenience. And those are very different mindsets. Like, oh, we just need to get through this for the moment and then things can return, versus the differentials that have been exposed. And so that's fundamental to this whole conversation.
No, I agree with that. And we clearly have tons of data to suggest these problems were there before the pandemic. You just, we are exacerbating them right now.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, it's hard to just, forecast too much about this. But
Sure.
I think there's a lot of change that can happen. I do think it's hard to differentiate when you don't understand your market. I still think most of our institutions don't understand our college students. If I hear one more person, and I'm just going to be, I'm just going to be
you.
Be you. That's
I
what
mean,
this is all
look,
about.
right?
It's just us three.
They're not kids. They're not kids.
Right.
They're not all dreaming of living on campus. Only 15% of American undergraduates live on a college campus. Okay. And it's half at 4 years, but it's still only half, right? They are not only all about themselves, they live in families and communities they care about. And they're not all sold on the idea that they have to go straight out of high school and straight through. If you understood that and gave them a chance to have multiple opportunities that would lead to high quality outcomes. The problem is what we're doing right now is steering all of them. We're telling them they have to come right out of high school because we don't create on-ramps for people who don't, right? Not real on-ramps that have high quality outcomes, right? We tell them they have to go full-time. Now we're trying to tell them they have to go more than full-time. We're trying to get everybody to cookie cutter this vision of the good old days. And like Stephanie Coontz had a book about the American family called The Way We Never Were. You know how we all fantasize about like Leave It to Beaver or Ozzie and Harriet?
Yeah.
Guess what? They didn't sleep in the same bed. And they didn't in higher ed either, okay? Right. So people have always been miserable in college, and there's always been problems, and there's always been the person who doesn't have a place to go home, and there's always been a food insecure student.
Well, and yet, part of what I've always wondered is do administrators by and large, or decision makers by and large, have those shared experiences or representative experiences, or do they always assume that students want the experience or the archetype of the experience that they believe they had? And I think there's a big shortcoming there, because I think we dive into the archetype of a college student and whether that's even a thing anymore. And how do we serve diverse students now when we don't have necessarily diverse leadership? And I was reminded of this when I heard the news of the fact that we will now, for the first time in the history of our country, have somebody on a major political ticket who is not an Ivy League educated person and the first person who was educated in HBCU. Like that's incredible to me in the history of our country. And I thought about that as it relates to higher education administration. Is that part of the challenge as well? Is this cognitive disconnect between what my lived experience might be and what I dream somebody else might think their experience ought to be?
Man, I mean, who had that experience? So I'm trying to.
Sure.
I think
Right.
we're just like Sarah said, while creating a myth. At the same time, I think of my leaders. They went to public institutions. They know what this is like. But we're looking. I don't even know what rabbit hole we're looking down. To be honest, it doesn't
Well,
make sense
you
to
guys
me.
are not in charge. I mean, right? You're UCLA, right?
Yeah,
Your future is dictated by where your legislators went,
correct.
right? Where your
Yeah,
governor went. Now,
yeah,
and
yeah.
things have gone a little more favorably when, in fact, the political leaders do come from, at least have some sort of background at a public institution. They've been to a community college. I think it matters. It reminds me a lot of, I adore Michelle Obama. Okay, I
Mhm.
do. I adore Michelle Obama. And yet I have struggled a little bit with Reach Higher because I still feel like you can see her college experience
Definitely.
at Princeton in
Yeah,
it, right?
yeah,
You can still feel it. And I want to be like, but that's not
yeah. It's a
even the
bootstrap.
way community colleges have been cast in that initiative still has, and again, I adore her. So I think that change is important. But I think to your point, LT, you and TJ both know there are plenty of student affairs professionals out there who've had the real college experience.
Sure.
They are not empowered. They are
Sure.
not listened to, right? They are traumatized and run into the ground and right out of the profession, right?
Are you speaking
So
my life right now?
Are you, are you,
I
are
think
you
I know a
watching
little
LT
bit,
on
a
camera?
little
Yeah.
bit about SA chat, just a tiny bit.
Yeah.
So
So I want to pivot a little bit. And the foundation of this podcast was thinking about placemaking on campus. And I don't know that we've really had a fair conversation about what placemaking means from the perspective of access. I think it's easy to talk about placemaking in terms of retail and in terms of, food and in terms of those types of things and the way places feel and look and creating a distinct campus environment. Are we missing something in terms of all of our students or access to higher ed when we think about placemaking in general? There's the tough question.
I'm letting her go first.
And when you say placemaking, are you actually
Mhm.
talking about like community building or is there?
Yeah, I mean, we think about placemaking in terms of sense of place. We think about placemaking in terms of, oftentimes when you think about retention of a student, it's from two different lenses. It's
Mhm.
retention of a
Yeah.
student at the institution itself. That's the more traditional language that we would hear in higher education. But then there's also this notion of retention of a student on campus throughout the parts of a day. Are they here? Are they in the place? Are they in the space or not? And if not, why? Where are they? And why are they not here? And that could be for a variety of reasons, and not the least of which is, hey, I have responsibilities. I got a job. I have a lot
Yeah.
of other things. So just thinking through, do we sort of blindly do this whole placemaking thing, thinking about one archetype of a student and miss some people? And if so, how could we potentially round that out a little bit?
Yeah. Thanks for that. I
Yeah.
know when I often start talking to people, let's say about the first gen population, one of the first things I say is you have to keep in mind that being a student is most likely not their primary identity. And for
Mhm.
some people, they clutch the pearls like, oh my gosh, this has to be number one. They've got to be good daughters, good employees. We haven't even talked about these students who are essential workers or their family members are essential workers. So there's so many other components to them. And so, part of it, yes, this goes back to like your very opening question. Like, it's
Mhm.
great. Some people need to be on campus, but it's not just for the mythology part, it's for the basic needs part. And yes, we also want them to feel included and we want them to have a sense of belonging. We also forget that some of these students are, many of these students are incredibly adept on digital spaces. And so some of us are having to catch up with where students already are create because they've had to form alternative communities because they don't feel connected on campus. And so
Yeah.
we need to be paying attention to and not intervening necessarily, but at least paying attention to the communities and the sense of place that they're also
Mhm.
forming somewhere else, which is where I've learned so much from students. is just following Twitter or just poking in on the class of 2024 Facebook group to learn about what they're really feeling.
Mm. And I tend to feel like there's a couple different types of students. There's students who eat every meal at Chick-fil-A, and there's students who wait outside conference rooms in the student center hoping that there was food served at that event so they could eat.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
I wonder if there's some middle ground that we might be able to find through the way that we do placemaking.
Look, if we were a business, we would try to figure out which of those groups is bigger and focus on them. And we do the complete opposite there. Okay, all my evidence is that the group that's looking for the free food is the bigger group. And yes, even at the campuses y'all work at, right? That I work at too. Right. And it may not be all in one day, right? It might not be, but at some point during their college careers, most students now are going to have some really deep financial struggles. Now, for 40 years, the National Center for Education Statistics has been surveying undergraduates. And one of the questions that they ask is this question that basically says, if you work, okay, so this is if you work, are you a student and worker, or are you a worker and a student? I'm probably paraphrasing this a little wrong, but they started this based on this idea that if you didn't answer student first, well, there you go. That predicts not retaining in school. And lo and behold, it does. Well, that's mainly because we treat those people differently. We structured the whole thing like your job is to be a student. And you know what? I'm going to argue, and this is my, sociologist in me, it's functional to do that because we're educating them for capitalism. And when they get out, they're going to be taught you are a worker first. Don't put if you do balance, it's just that you have your family around your work. But we keep telling people what their center identity has to be for success. And we get it all wrong. And, I don't want everybody to be like the community colleges. I just want them to understand what they do well. Community colleges do not do this because it would not work. Right. They like that people are parents. They like that, sisters and moms. By the way, if you acknowledge that somebody is actually connected to their family and community, you could actually recruit other family members and friends to be students too. It's good from a business perspective.
Right.
Educating a broader group, what a novel concept. So I want to take one last pivot, and as we always do, we want to focus on opportunity in the podcast. Yeah, pivot. It's our favorite word in the industry right now, even though we didn't do it. In terms of opportunities, because we always want to end on opportunities. What are we learning right now, or what learning has been accelerated that really we ought to take advantage of, so that as we come out, whatever the other side of this is, I don't want to say new normal because that's another one of those words that we're all overusing, but when we find ourselves in some semblance of what will feel a little more normal moving forward, or more steady moving forward, what opportunities do you hope that we will have learned from and taken advantage of as an industry moving forward?
Go for it, LT.
And don't do this to me, because I swear I was an optimist before this.
Did this all break you? No.
This broke me, TJ. This broke me. There's some positives I'm seeing, even though with the caveat is kind of late in my opinion, or, I am seeing some cross-campus collaborations. I am seeing people come together and start to identify what are the challenges before they already raise their hand with a solution. And this is why I say this. There were people who were saying, oh, I really want to do this really cool thing online for our students this fall, right? That great idea that they had was Animal Crossing Online, or whatever it is, was so divorced and disconnected from a student's actual experience. And so what I'm now seeing are people starting to take a step back and pause and say, what is actually happening? And let's build and design something around that. So here's a great example. Instead of now, whatever it was, like I said, Animal Crossing Online or UCLA version of something, now students are telling us during our welcome week, the hurrah and the band and all that type of stuff, students have said, can you tell me how I can get Microsoft Word? Can you tell me how I can connect to my library? We were not doing that really well at all. We were just throwing people in, giving them parades and the cheerleaders and all that type of stuff. And now we're actually listening to students tell us what they really need. It does go back to who are the majority of our students, and those are the things they do not know.
That's right.
How about you, Sarah?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's the opportunity, and that's the thing that's happened is actually some institutions, and more of them than we had before, are waking up to the fact that their students are humans first. And you know what's so interesting is basically you're talking about good onboarding.
Mhm.
You can't ask people to buy into
Definitely.
your campus culture if you haven't given them any tools yet. Now, you need to tell them the why. I mean, right? You got to get to why with your students. And if your students don't know what it is that, why their education matters and such, and they're not bought into that, you have a bigger problem. But we don't give people basic tools. We don't want to tell them where the campus food pantry is because we don't want to admit that anybody would have to have a campus food pantry. That's ridiculous. What has happened in the last couple of months, though, that has made me optimistic, we had a federal program on emergency aid, which recognizes that Title IV sometimes doesn't cut it. And you know what? $6 billion went out the door, and people didn't buy flat screen TVs. They paid their rent. Children ate, and it was okay. And some institutions wisened up to the fact that they didn't know how to distribute emergency aid well and learned how to. Others are asking for help now, learning how to do basic needs work. Fantastic. California had an idea, but I can tell you about the rest of y'all, not so much. And at the Hope Center, we're now hearing from places we never expected to, and funders who want to support that work, which that could transform higher ed, because once you see your
Right.
students as humans, you do everything differently.
Okay, that's fair, Sarah. That's fair. Okay, I feel a little better.
Now you're optimistic again. Well, and the
It
other
won't
thing
last long.
I think I'd go back to is what you said about the nature of work. What we've said on the pod quite a bit is, boy, we hope we really learn something about the nature of work, about who needs to be in the office and when. And higher ed has tended to be a very input-based culture or rules-based culture, and not an outcomes-based culture. It'd be really, really interesting if we can make some of that shift as we go. I want to thank the two of you. It's been a tremendous conversation, an important conversation, and it really pushing us to think a little bit more about who are our students, what are better ways to serve them, and I really appreciate the conversation. Come back next week. We're going to be talking with our folks from SCUP and other strategic planning and higher education. It seems like strategic planning gets harder and harder, especially as the earth continues to move under our feet, and we're going to have a big conversation about it next week. For now, we wish you well and say have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, TJ.
Thank you.
Thank you.